Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Mr. White here with your Unit 5 test review. So by now you guys know the drill. Get out your test review paper and follow along as we go over these answers to help you get ready for that Unit 5 test, all about business organizations, market competition, and international trade. All right, so first up is market competition. When we talk about market competition, remember there's sort of a spectrum of types of businesses that are considered more competitive, all the way to types of businesses where there's virtually no competition at all. And it all depends on the kind of product you sell and how easy it is or how hard it is to get into selling that product. So the most competitive kind of market, because it's the easiest one to get into, is what we call perfect competition. In perfect competition, you got many sellers, and it's actually pretty easy to start a business in perfect competition. Now, part of the problem of perfect competition is that all the products are identical. So there's no way to tell your product apart from somebody else's product. And for that reason, the price in perfect competition is not determined by the seller, and it's really not determined by the buyer either. It's only determined by supply and demand. So if there's a high demand of your product, the price will be low. I should take that back. I should say if there's a high supply of your product, the price would be low. Low supply, the price would be high. If there's high demand, the price would be high. Low demand, price would be low. Basically, you have no control over the price, and that's why this is the hardest kind of competition to survive in. It's the most competitive. All right, next up is monopolistic competition. Do not confuse this with a monopoly. It's not the same thing as a monopoly. When we talk about monopolistic competition, for one thing, there are many sellers. So that right there tells you it's not a monopoly. And just like in perfect competition, it's really not that hard to start this kind of business. It's not as easy as perfect competition, but it's definitely not as hard as an oligopoly. Now, the thing about monopolistic competition is that the products are similar, but not identical. So for example, you have many different companies that sell sports apparel, but there's only one Nike and there's only one Adidas. The thing is that they don't compete necessarily based on the price. So for example, Nike might charge significantly more for their products than Adidas. The reason why is because the way that companies compete in monopolistic competition is through what we call non-price competition. So in this type of market, the most important thing is the brand name and the kind of advertising or the features that that brand offers. So sporting goods is a great example. Jeans is another example we've used in class. So just remember that these are all little monopolies. For example, Nike is the only company that's allowed to call their product Nike and put a swoosh on it, just like Adidas is the only company that's allowed to call their product Adidas and put 3 stripes on it. If anybody else did that, they'd get sued. And so that's why we would call these little monopolies. Okay. Now, next up is oligopoly competition. And when you get into an oligopoly, there's really not much competition because there's only about 3 to 5 major companies that sell or produce this product or service. So it's very, very hard to start up one of these products or one of these kind of companies. When we talk about oligopolies, it's things that you would need probably billions of dollars or really, really specific knowledge and tools to be able to create. So a great example of this would be like cell phone companies or oil companies or car companies. It would be really hard for you to start your own cell phone company or your own oil company or your own car company. And so that's why there just aren't that many companies that sell those particular products. Now, the products that they sell or the services they provide are pretty similar. Like it would be kind of hard to tell the difference between the service you get from Verizon or from AT&T. So just like in monopolistic competition, they do have some non-price competition. That's why you'll hear the different cell phone companies bashing each other, talking about why their service is better. They don't really say that their prices are better most of the time. Sometimes they might. Now, the thing about these 3 to 5 mega companies is they exercise what's called price leadership, which means that they get to basically set the price for everybody else in the market who's trying to sell that product. So, for example, when it comes to airlines, there are 4 major airlines: American Airlines, Delta, United, and Southwest. Those 4 airlines get to basically decide how much it costs to fly in an airplane, and they also decide other things like how much it costs if you want to bring bags on the airplanes, because we know nowadays some airplanes even charge you for your bags. It's crazy. But that's what we mean by price leadership. If the 4 big companies do it, everybody else is going to do it. So wireless service, airplanes, car companies, oil companies, those are all great examples of oligopolies. Now, The least kind of competitive market, the one where there basically is no competition, is a monopoly. When you have a monopoly, that means there's only one seller, and it's basically impossible for anybody else to start up a business doing the same thing that you do. Usually because the government has this market regulated and they only allow one company to provide that good or service. So the product they provide is unique, or the service they provide is unique. Nobody else can provide it, and for that reason there's no competition. But because of the fact that the government wants to promote competition, that's why for a monopoly to exist, the government would actually have to approve it. So the monopoly is the price maker, which means they're the ones who gets to determine the price because they're the only ones selling that product. And a great example of this could be Metro. In Houston, there's only one company that offers bus service, and that's Metro. So Metro gets to decide how many buses are on the street. They also get to decide how much it costs to ride on the bus. And if you don't like it, too bad. I guess you could just get your own car, or you could walk, because Metro is the only bus service that you have available. All right, next up, business organizations. Now, when we talk about business organizations, remember that the most numerous kind of business in the United States is what we call a sole proprietorship. Most of the time we think of this as a small business. A sole proprietorship means that there's only one owner of the business, and this one owner gets to keep all the profits and make all the decisions. That's a really good thing. There's also not very many regulations, so the owner has a lot of freedom to do things the way they want. So this is what we think of as most small businesses. Most small businesses in the United States are sole proprietorships. Now the downside is that it's very hard to raise money when you're doing a sole proprietorship. All the money has to come from you, or you would personally have to get loans to get your business started. And another drawback is that you have unlimited liability in your business, meaning that if anything goes wrong, you, the owner, are the one who has to handle it. So if somebody sues your company, you, the owner, have to go to court, and you, the owner, are basically being sued. Now, for this reason, a lot of sole proprietorships have a pretty short lifespan, which means that when the owner dies, or if the owner can no longer run the business usually goes away. So I guess a really simple example of this could be like if you ran your own lemonade stand. If you started your own lemonade stand in your neighborhood and you're the one who owns it, you get to keep all the profits and make all the decisions, then your lemonade stand would be a sole proprietorship. Now, the next kind of business organization is a partnership. Some people don't want to take all that risk by themselves, so when they decide to start a business, they will join up with 2 or more other people that will help them run the business. Now, just like in a sole proprietorship, you get to keep all the profits and you get to make all the decisions, so that's a good thing. Also, there aren't very many regulations because most partnerships are also small businesses, but they have a lot of the same drawbacks as a sole proprietorship. Like, for example, it's hard to raise money. You're going to have to go in the bank and get a loan yourself, you and your partners. So if one of your partners has bad credit, well, that's going to make it harder for your business to get the loans and to get the money they need. Also, just like with a sole proprietorship, you and your partners have unlimited liability. So if something goes wrong with the business, if the business gets sued, it's you and your partners who are on the hook. So for that reason, just like with a sole proprietorship, they tend to have a pretty short lifespan. A great example is law firms. All the time you see law firms that have names like Jim Adler and Associates. So Jim Adler, the Texas Hammer, him and some of his partners started up this law firm, and they're running the law firm together. They get to make the decisions and keep the profits and make all the crazy commercials for Jim Adler and Associates. Now, a corporation is the kind of businesses that most of us recognize because they're the biggest businesses in the U.S., but they actually account for the smallest percentage of businesses in the U.S. There really aren't that many corporations compared to partnerships or sole proprietorships. A corporation means a big business that's not owned by one or a handful of people, but rather a big business that sells stock, and therefore it's owned by shareholders. Now, if you don't know what stock is, guys, when you buy stock, what you're doing is you're buying ownership of a company. You're buying like one little tiny piece of ownership in a company. Now, because of the fact that there are many owners who all own stock, the profits have to be shared between all of the stockholders. Now, these businesses, because they're so big, are the most heavily regulated. The government makes lots of rules they have to follow, mostly because the bigger the business is, the more impact it can have on our economy if something goes wrong. And so the government wants to make sure that these big businesses are operating in a way that doesn't put the whole economy at risk. That's why they have to follow so many rules. Now, for a big business like a corporation, it's very easy to raise money, not only because they can sell stock, which is the number one easy way that they can make money, but also because when the corporation gets a loan, it's actually the corporation that gets the money, not one individual person. So as long as the corporation is viewed as a trustworthy corporation, it's very easy for the corporation to get loans. Now, there's limited liability, which is another good thing about a corporation. You know, if something goes wrong with the corporation, like for example, let's say if somebody slips and falls down in a Walmart, it's not like everybody who owns Walmart stock is getting sued. It's the corporation Walmart that gets sued, and all the shareholders are actually protected from that legal action. Now, for this reason, corporations tend to have a really long lifespan. Most of the time, they outlive their founder. You know, a great example is Walmart. Sam Walton, the guy who started Walmart, he died back in the early 90s, but Walmart is still going strong today. So that's a good example of how corporations tend to last a really long time. Now, another kind of corporation is called a franchise, and a franchise is unique because it's a corporation that allows people to open up a branch or a location of the major corporation. You know, the number one thing we think of when we hear franchise is like fast food. So McDonald's is a perfect example. Now, the number of owners of a franchise can vary because a franchise doesn't necessarily have to be a corporation. Like for example, Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A is not a corporation. They don't sell stock, but they are a franchise. So they do allow some people to open up branches of their company. Now, whenever you have a franchise, the profits would be shared by the individual entrepreneur who owns the store or the location and the parent company. So if you opened your own Chick-fil-A, you get to keep some of the profits, but then some of the profits go to the Chick-fil-A headquarters. Now, just like corporations, franchises are very heavily regulated because, like corporations, franchises tend to be really big and they can have a big effect on our economy. So we want to make sure they're doing everything the right way. Just like a corporation, it's also very easy for a franchise to raise capital. Not only because the individual entrepreneurs get help from the parent company, but also because the parent company will find it easy to get loans just because of the fact that they're so big. So just like a corporation, they have a long lifespan. And if you're an individual entrepreneur, it's much easier to start one of these kind of businesses, a franchise, than it is to start your own sole proprietorship or a partnership, mostly because you get a lot of help from the parent company. So great example here, like we said, is McDonald's. The last kind of business organization that you need to know about is a nonprofit. It is what it sounds like, a company that doesn't try to make profit. Now, the number of owners of a nonprofit can vary. It might be like one person or a small group of people that owns it, or it could be a nonprofit that sells stock. Now, the thing that makes a nonprofit unique is that the company does charitable work. They're trying to do something good for the community. And so they're not out trying to get rich. Obviously, the people who run the nonprofit need to get paid. But beyond paying the staff and paying for the good works that they do, all the money just goes into social causes. It does not go into, making people more rich or to shareholders so that they can make a profit. Now, these companies are very heavily regulated, mostly because they don't pay any taxes. One of the great things about being a nonprofit is that most of the time you're going to be tax exempt. So the Salvation Army would be a great example of a nonprofit. Other companies like Goodwill or the American Red Cross, and I think we even talked about in my class, even the NFL is considered a nonprofit organization. So all of these companies don't have to pay any taxes because they're supposed to be doing good for the community. All right, next up, government intervention. That means when the government gets involved in business activities to try to make the market more fair. Now, going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, our government passed a lot of what we call antitrust laws. Antitrust laws are laws that protect competition by restricting the formation of monopolies and preventing collusion between companies. In case you didn't know, collusion is a secret agreement to fix prices or to limit production of a good or a service. So kind of like in Monopoly, right? Go to jail. We started breaking up these monopolies in the early part of the 20th century because the government wanted to make things more fair for consumers. Now, in today's society, or I should say in today's economy, the government will sometimes allow monopolies to exist. But if the government decides to break up a monopoly, we call that deregulation. Now, a great example of deregulation happened right here in the city of Houston back in the late 90s. I can tell you when I was a kid growing up, there was only one electric company in Houston. It was called HL&P, Houston Lighting and Power. But the government decided that it was better to break up HL&P and let competition decide the price of electricity. And so that's when we got companies like CenterPoint, Texas Genco, and Reliant. Those companies were all part of HL&P, but the government deregulated that market and split it up into 3 separate companies so we could have more competition and better prices. Now, another thing the government will do to allow a monopoly to exist, or a type of monopoly, is that the government grants what are called copyrights. A copyright is legal protection for intellectual property that's artistic in nature. The owner of the copyright, meaning like the person who comes up with the artistic idea, has a monopoly over their unique creation for a limited time. When it comes to copyrights in the US, you actually have the right to your music or your movies or whatever you create for up to 70 years. Okay? Now, the last thing is a patent. A patent is legal protection for intellectual property that involves an invention or some kind of an innovation. The owner of a copyright, or excuse me, not a copyright, of a patent has a monopoly over their unique invention for a limited time, 20 years, just like a copyright. That's probably why it says copyright in there. Brain wasn't working so good when I typed this up. Y'all will have to excuse me. So like, for example, if you invented a new kind of medicine, like this mad scientist on the screen here, you would be able to be the only one to produce your medicine for 20 years, and then after that, other people can produce it. So these are like limited monopolies that the government grants that will encourage people to invent new things. That's the whole reason why we have copyrights and patents. We want to make it to where people can profit off of their ideas or their inventions. Otherwise, there wouldn't be much incentive for people to spend a lot of time inventing things or coming up with new ideas. All right, now, mergers and acquisitions. I know it doesn't say acquisitions on your sheet, but just know that when you get out in the real world, you won't just hear the word merger, you'll also hear acquisition. Just so you know, guys, a merger is when 2 companies combine resources and management, and they basically become one company. An acquisition is when one company buys control over another company. Okay, so like buying somebody out. Now, the first kind of merger is what's called a horizontal merger. A horizontal merger is the combination of 2 companies that produce the same good or service. A great example of this happened back in 2011 when AT&T tried to merge with T-Mobile. That would be considered a horizontal merger because AT&T and T-Mobile are both wireless service companies, so they do the same thing. Now, it's just noteworthy that this was not allowed to happen because of antitrust laws, which is what we just talked about a minute ago. Now, a vertical merger is a little bit different. A vertical merger is the combination of 2 companies that are involved in different steps of the production of a single product. So here we go. Let's talk about AT&T again. Right now, one of the biggest stories is that AT&T is trying to merge with Time Warner. If you didn't know, guys, Time Warner is the company that owns like Warner Brothers Studios, CNN, HBO, lots of television and production companies. Whereas AT&T is a platform that distributes entertainment through mobile and TV, like DirecTV and Uverse. So this would be 2 different steps of the same product, right? The product is entertainment. AT&T distributes the entertainment. Time Warner creates the entertainment. So if they came together, that would be 2 different steps in the process of providing entertainment. And so that's why that would be considered a vertical merger. Now, the last one is not actually a merger. The last one is sort of like the result of a bunch of mergers, which is a conglomerate. A conglomerate is like a mega corporation, a really big corporation that produces several different products or services that really aren't necessarily related to each other. Now, Samsung is one of our best examples. Samsung is a South Korean company, and I think most of us, when we hear Samsung, we think of phones. But it's important to know that Samsung produces a lot more than phones. They produce all kinds of consumer electronics, like Samsung Gear, right, or the Samsung Watch. They also make chemicals, they make home appliances, they make ships. I mean, can you believe that? They make boats. They also make semiconductors and solid-state drives for your computer. They are involved in telecommunications and medical equipment and a bunch of other stuff. I don't even have enough room to tell you all the different businesses that Samsung's involved in. So that's what a conglomerate means, a mega business that produces lots of different goods and services. Now, international trade. It's a good thing, okay? International trade helps everybody to be better off. So let's just go over a couple basic terms. First term is import. Can't talk today. An import is a product that's sold to our country from another country. The way I like to remember this is that imports come into our country. Now, the next term is export. Exports are products that are sold by our country to other countries. So the way I remember this one is that exports exit our country. Now, a trade deficit is what happens when the quantity of imports in our country is greater than the quantity of exports. So in other words, when our country buys more goods and services from other countries than we sell to other countries, that would be called a trade deficit. Now, specialization is another term that makes trade possible. Specialization is when a country produces only the goods and services for which it has a comparative advantage, which means we only produce the things for which we have a low opportunity cost. Keep that in mind. That's going to be important when we start talking about terms of trade and comparative advantage. Now, the pros of free trade, the reason why free trade is good, is that number one, it gives consumers lower prices. Everybody gets things for cheaper when there's more competition. Also, as consumers, we get a greater variety of goods and services to choose from. Instead of just having goods and services from the US, we can choose from goods and services that come from every country around the world. Also, the quality of goods will increase because of all the competition. In other words, if American cars are not good quality, but Japanese cars are, then nobody will buy the American cars. And so that forces the American car companies to increase their quality. And altogether, when we get lower prices, more goods and services, and better quality goods and services, it leads to a better standard of living for everybody, not just for us, but also for people in other countries. Now, the downside, the cons of trade, especially free trade. Number one, it can cause us to lose jobs. That's one thing that Donald Trump talked about a lot in the election, was the idea that America loses a lot of jobs because we import so many goods and services from abroad. So the idea is that if we import less stuff, then there will be more jobs here because people in our country will have to fill demand for all those goods and services. Now, another thing that's difficult for American companies to do is compete with foreign companies. And so sometimes it can be hard for our domestic industries and businesses to be able to stay in business when they have to compete with foreign rivals. A great example of this could be things like textiles. Textiles means woven cloth. America used to make lots of woven cloth, but now we pretty much don't make any. The reason why is because we have to compete with countries like India and Bangladesh and Honduras and China. All those countries can produce for a lower opportunity cost than us. And so therefore now we mostly just import textiles. We don't really produce them anymore. And so those would be the downsides of trade. Now, when we talk about free trade, the opposite of that would be called protectionism. Now, when we say free trade, what that means is free trade, or trade without barriers or limits. So NAFTA is one great example of a free trade agreement that we have in the US. What it does is it allows free trade between the USA, Canada, and Mexico. So in other words, if we want to buy cars from Mexico, or if we want to sell computers to Canada, there's no extra barriers or taxes involved. And what that does is it benefits the economies of all three countries. Now, on the worldwide scale, there's what we call the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is an international group that promotes free trade and economic cooperation between all countries. So it's a place where countries can go to settle trade disputes and also to try to have more cooperation in their economic structure. Now, protectionism, that's when we try to limit or restrict trade to protect domestic jobs and industries. Remember, we said that is one big concern of free trade, is that it causes us to lose jobs and some of our businesses can't compete. So the ways that we do that is usually through tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. What that does is it makes imports more expensive than domestically produced goods, and hopefully that will increase demand for domestically produced products. Now, an embargo is a total shutdown of trade between two countries. A great example of that is that currently, right now, we have an embargo on North Korea. That means that we don't sell anything to North Korea, and we also don't buy anything from North Korea. It's a total shutdown of trade. Now, a quota is a legal limit on the quantity of trade that can take place between two countries. So, for example, maybe we could have a quota on trade between the United States and Mexico. If we had a quota on trade between the United States and Mexico, that means that we are restricted in how many goods and services we can buy from Mexico every year. Once we hit that limit, we can't buy anything else from them. Last up, safety regulations could be another reason to limit free trade. Sometimes other countries don't have the same level of cleanliness or I guess you could say safety precautions, and for that reason we may not want to import goods and services from those countries because we're worried that they might be bad for our health. A great example of this happened back in the early 2000s. Some companies were importing toothpaste from China, and it turned out that some of that toothpaste actually had antifreeze in it. Antifreeze is like what you put in the radiator of your car to keep it from overheating. Now, antifreeze is really poisonous, and so a lot of people got sick from using this Chinese-made toothpaste. And so for a while, we had a total shutdown of all imported toothpaste from China because we were worried about safety. All right, now, the effect of trade on currency. Hopefully you remember currency means money. So when we trade, it changes the value of our money. remember that we call it strong money when a particular currency is more valuable than other currencies. And we call it weak money when a particular currency is less valuable than other currencies. So let's look at an example. In Mexico, they use pesos. So right here you can see 100 pesos. Now, 100 pesos is not worth as much as $100. $100 is worth a lot more than 100 pesos. 100 pesos is the equivalent of about $5, whereas $100 is the equivalent of $100. So you can only buy $5 worth of stuff with 100 pesos, but you can buy $100 worth of stuff with 100 US dollars. However, the US dollar is not the strongest currency in the world. As a matter of fact, one currency that's stronger than the US dollar is the euro. So 100 euros is actually stronger than the US dollar, so it's worth more than $100. As a matter of fact, 100 euros could buy you about $120 worth of goods and services. So you notice here, the peso is less than the dollar, and the dollar is less than the euro. That's what we mean by strong money and weak money. Now, when countries trade with each other, it can cause their currency value to appreciate. Appreciation means when the value of a currency increases relative to other countries. So for example, if the value of the dollar became greater than the value of the euro, we would call that appreciation. However, depreciation is when the value of a currency decreases relative to other countries. So if the value of the dollar went down relative to the peso, we could say that the value of the dollar depreciated. If the $100 became worth less than 100 pesos, we'd say that there was depreciation of the value of the dollar. All right, absolute advantage versus comparative advantage. Remember, this is that stuff about trade. So some people don't believe that trade is good, but the cool thing is math can actually prove to us that trade benefits everybody involved. We just got to know a couple of terms first. The first term is absolute advantage. That means the ability to create more of a good or service than others. So remember, the absolute advantage is just about how much you can create. It has nothing to do with your opportunity cost. So for example, if we said that Japan could make 100 computers per day and the US can make 95 computers per day, we would say that Japan has an absolute advantage in the production of computers. The reason why is because Japan can make more computers than the US. 100 is more than 95. Hopefully everybody got that. Now, comparative advantage is different. Comparative advantage means the ability to produce a good or service for a lower opportunity cost than anybody else. So this is the one where you actually have to do a little bit of math to prove that it makes sense. For example, let's say that it costs Japan 100 computers to manufacture one truck, but it costs the USA 75 computers to manufacture one truck. That means that the USA has a comparative advantage in the production of trucks. The reason why? We give up fewer computers when we produce one truck than Japan does. That's what we mean by having a lower opportunity cost. So let's take a look at how this works by looking at a few examples. Okay? First off, when we talk about comparative advantage in the terms of trade, we have to identify whether it's an output problem or an input problem. When we talk about an output problem, what we're asking is how much output will each country get from a fixed amount of inputs? So the way you know it's an output problem is that it's the output that varies. So like if you take a look at this little table right here, we're talking about hats per day or shoes per day. The day is your input, like how much time you need. And you notice that it's the same amount of time. But when you look at how many hats or how many shoes each country can make, the output is different, meaning the amount that they create is different with the same amount of resources or the same amount of inputs. And so that's how we know this is an output problem. So whenever we're looking at an output problem, remember we say output other over, or OOO, output other over. So what we do is we take hats and we put it over shoes. It would look something like this. 4 divided by 20. 4 divided by 20 is 0.2 or 20%. We do the same thing with 15 over 30. 15 divided by 30 is 0.5. So the number that we get here is the opportunity cost. So for Honduras, the opportunity cost of producing one pair of shoes is 20% of a hat. I'm not sure how you get 20% of a hat, but that's their opportunity cost. The opportunity cost for El Salvador to produce one pair of shoes is half of a hat. Okay, so 20% of a hat is less than half of a hat. So we would say that Honduras has the comparative advantage at producing shoes. The reason why Honduras has a comparative advantage at producing shoes is because their opportunity cost, 0.2, is less than the opportunity cost of El Salvador, 0.5. Now, we'll do the same thing on the other side. Other goes over. So we'll say 20 divided by 4. 20 divided by 4 is 5. Then we'll say 30 divided by 15. 30 divided by 15 is 2. So when it comes to making one hat, it costs Honduras 5 pairs of shoes. When it comes to making one hat, it costs El Salvador 2 pairs of shoes. So that means that El Salvador has the comparative advantage at making hats because it costs them fewer shoes to make one hat. So Honduras should specialize in making shoes because their opportunity cost is lower than El Salvador's. El Salvador should specialize in making hats because their opportunity cost is lower than Honduras. Now, when it comes to the terms of trade, what you need to do is you need to find a number that falls in between the opportunity cost of both parties. So a number that falls in between 5 and 2. One number that falls in between 5 and 2 would be 3 or 4. So we could basically say that one hat is worth anywhere between 2 to 5 pairs of shoes. In other words, if El Salvador wanted to trade one hat for 3 pairs of shoes with Honduras, that would actually make both sides better off. All right, now the other kind of method is what we call the input method. When we talk about the input method, it means how many inputs does it, let me start over again. Input method means how many inputs does each country need to get for a specific amount of output. So it's the inputs that vary this time around. So you'll notice here we got one car or one truck. That means the output is the same, right? Whereas it takes 3 hours to make one car in France or 4 hours to make one car in Germany. It takes 9 hours to make one truck in France or 9 hours to make one truck in Germany. So what's different on this is that the amount of time it takes is different. Remember, time is an input, and so that's how we know this is an input problem. Whenever we have an input problem, we say input other under. So IOU, input other under. So what we would do is we would say 9 divided by 3, and that gives us 3. And then we would say 8 divided by 4, which gives us 2. Once again, we're looking for the lowest number here. So Germany has the lowest opportunity cost of producing trucks because they only give up 2 cars for every 1 truck that they make, whereas France gives up 3 cars for every 1 truck that they make. Now, on the other side, we do input other under. So we would say 3 divided by 9, which is 0.3, and 4 divided by 8, which is 0.5. So on this side, 0.3 is less than 0.5, and so we would say that France has the lowest opportunity cost of producing a car. Therefore, France should specialize in making cars because their opportunity cost is lower than Germany. We can say they have a comparative advantage at producing cars. Germany should focus on making trucks because their opportunity cost is lower than France for making trucks. So we would say that Germany has a comparative advantage at making trucks. Now, once again, if we want to know the terms of trade, I would just look at the whole numbers and just find something that's in between 3 and 2. So we could say one truck is worth between 2 to 3 cars. I'm not sure how you get half a car, right? But like, for example, if France wanted to trade one car, or excuse me, if France wanted to trade 2 cars for 1 truck with Germany, that would make both sides better off. Or if France wanted to trade 3 cars for 1 truck with Germany, also that would work. Or I don't know how you could do 2.5, but heck, they could even do 2.5 cars or 2.75 cars. Any of that for 1 truck would make both sides better off. So those would be our terms of trade. All right, the free response question. Now that we've just gone over this whole thing about comparative advantage in terms of trade, you need to use that information to be able to answer this free response question. So what I highly recommend to you is to do it right now. Don't wait till you're in class and you're like under pressure because time's running out. Go ahead and get the answer right now. And heck, If you come to me before the test and show it to me, I'll even tell you if it's right. Holy crap, what a great advantage. You can basically give yourself 10 points just by doing it right now. So please, 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 please do it right now. Okay, so notice that the way I've set up this table is a little bit different. So across the top, we've got the names of our countries, and across the side, we've got the particular things they're creating. So don't let that screw you up. Make sure that when you're looking at the opportunity cost, you're actually doing it the right way. So if you need to redraw this to look like the last two graphs that we looked at, that's fine. But just make sure that you're doing it for the right country, because that's one place a lot of people get mixed up. Okay, so we're going to refer to this chart. We're going to answer the following questions. We're going to assume that both Lakes Land and Springs Land can produce corn and wheat using equal amounts of resources. If they're using equal amounts of resources, then it must be the output that varies. Think about that. So first of all, what is the opportunity cost of producing a bushel of corn for each country? You need to do that output method to figure out what is the opportunity cost for each country. Then you'll have to tell me who has an absolute advantage at producing wheat. Remember what absolute advantage means. It's not the same as comparative advantage. If you've already forgot the difference, then rewind a little bit and go back and look again, because you need to know that. Now, which country has a comparative advantage in corn production? Once again, this is where you got to do that output other over thing to figure out who has the lowest opportunity cost of producing corn. Now, if each country specializes, what will Springs Land import? Keep in mind that means that Springs Land is going to specialize and produce one thing, and so they're going to need to buy the other thing from Lakes Land. So tell me basically, what is Springs Land going to buy from Lakes Land? And the last thing, what is the minimum price that Lakes Land will accept to export corn to Springs Land? This is where I'm asking you about the terms of trade. So once you've done all your comparative advantage calculations, you need to look at the opportunity cost for wheat and for corn and figure out what would make both sides better off. Essentially, you just need to find a number that's in between the opportunity cost of both countries. So for example, if you're looking at wheat, you would say one wheat is equal to between this and this corn. And just look for the lowest number. The lowest number means like what's the minimum that Lakes Land would accept to export corn to Springs Land. Okay, so make sure that for each one you explain, and the best way to explain is just to show your work mathematically. Okay, if you just show me your work mathematically, that works for me as an explanation. Now, of course, guys, if you have any questions, please come see me or holler at me right before the test. I'd be happy to help you out. Otherwise, good luck on your test, and I'll see you next time.